Take Back Your Health Now, Episode 24. You're listening to the Take Back Your Health Now podcast, the show that interviews the top doctors, athletes, trainers, and entrepreneurs to help you find the holy grail of health. Now here's your host, Dr. Dan Margolin.
Hi, this is Dr. Dan Margolin with another segment of Take Back Your Health Now, where we pull out all the stops in search of health's holy grail. Now, we are really excited today to have Robb Wolf, a former research biochemist and the New York Times best-selling author of the Paleo Solution, the original human diet. He is a student of Professor Loren Cordain, author of the Paleo Diet. Robb has transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people around the world via his top-ranked iTunes podcasts, book, and seminars. Robb, welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks, Doc. With a bio like that, I feel like I should be taller than 5'9", but thank you.
Understood. It is awesome. It is awesome what you're doing. So just give us a little understanding, like what first got you interested in the paleo diet? Just go into that a little bit.
Well, you know, the interest originally was just health and performance in general. Like I was a competitive power lifter, competitive Thai boxer in my youth, and I was raised in a household that both parents were pretty sick. Both of them smoked. Both of them ended up developing type 2 diabetes in their late 30s, early 40s. And I just had kind of a sneaky suspicion that there was probably a better way to go about doing things. And in that effort to figure things out, I did a lot of dietary experimentation. And one of the paths that I went down was a really high carb, low fat kind of vegetarian way of eating. And for me and my physiology, and maybe it is because I'm mainly caveman, I'm not totally sure, but it really didn't work very well for me. I ended up with ulcerative colitis and a lot of GI problems, some very disordered blood lipids. And it was kind of a moment of desperation that this idea of a paleo or an ancestral type diet kind of got on my radar. This was back in 1998 when I was doing just kind of benchtop research related to lipid metabolism, cancer, and autoimmunity. And so this idea got on my radar, and I started poking around a little bit. There was this newfangled search engine called Google at that time, and I put, Paleo Diet into the search engine, and I found a couple of folks like Loren Cordain and Arthur Devaney, and it was just really off to the races from there. And I implemented what was then kind of a low-carb, paleo-type diet. And I got to say, within days, the ulcerative colitis symptoms were completely resolved within a matter of weeks. I had regained all the weight that I had lost. I was still eating like about 4,000 calories a day, trying to maintain my weight. But right. I had such terrible malabsorption that I was dead. I walk around normally about 175 pounds, reasonably fit and lean. I was down to 130 pounds due to malabsorption.
Oh, my God. What were you eating? Like a lot of bread, or what was your diet at that time?
It was like, and that's kind of the funny thing. I went and checked out like the Georgia Shawa Macrobiotic Institute, and I was, soaking and sprouting my grains and legumes and, cooking them, properly. And
right.
By all, accounts properly. But, for my physiology, again, mainly Northern European, Scottish, Swedish being the kind of main derivatives, that approach just really did not work for me, or at least not at that point in my life. And so this tweak in my nutrition was pretty profound. And at that point, I was really thinking about a career in medicine or potentially pursuing a research track. But when I found this paleo diet concept, the idea of going to medical school seemed really, turning left to turn right. Like I was going to spend 8 years learning about disease and pathology and mainly be within a disease and pathology kind of framework, when I really felt like I had this operating system that really thought about sleep, food, exercise, the gut biome, and our greater, kind of human community, that those were the pillars of health, and that's what you needed to focus on. And it didn't seem like the doctors that I was shadowing didn't seem like they had a whole lot of time to talk about that stuff, and this was even before the medical system has shifted or slid as much as it has, such that, doctors have like 5, maybe 10 minutes with a patient. There's really not much opportunity for deep vetting. And so I did something kind of wacky. I happened to have been one of the first people to find this thing called CrossFit online back in 2000, 2001. And I co-founded.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I interviewed Kelly Starrett. I think he was one of the founders or something of that as well, right?
Well, he came in quite a bit later, but I actually I co-founded the first and fourth CrossFit affiliate gyms in the world. I actually wrote the first affiliate inquiry email ever, and so and for the people that like CrossFit, they think that's kind of cool. For the people that dislike CrossFit, then I'm kind of the antichrist. But it's just kind of
we're just going to broadcast. We're just going to broadcast to the people that like it, so you're fine.
Okay, perfect. But it was interesting running a gym where you had this good exercise modality. You had a really, really powerful, supportive community, and I had this opportunity to, talk to people about food and sleep and circadian rhythm. We had a really huge impact on the people that we worked with, and within about 2 years of opening the gym, we were picked by Men's Health as one of the top 30 gyms in America. So we started really making some pretty good waves, using this paleo diet or ancestral health approach, which wasn't just the food. It was community and sleep and photo period and modulating stress levels and all that type of stuff. So
Rob, go into that a little. So first of all, paleo, what does that mean? The word paleo itself, is that referencing, what is that reference?
It's a holdover from the research of anthropologists and archaeologists from the early 1900s for the most part. These folks noticed that these hunter-gatherer groups that ate what we would call a paleo type diet, which there's not actually one flavor of that. It's very different depending on if you live near the Arctic Circle versus like the Amazon rainforest. But it was basically, wild-caught foods, roots, shoots, tubers, fruits, vegetables, seasonal variation and whatnot. But it was an observation that these folks, despite not having modern Western medical interventions, these folks were pretty darn healthy. Like they seemed to be largely devoid of cardiovascular disease, seemed to have very low rates of cancer. Type 2 diabetes was largely unheard of until they started shifting and eating a more westernized diet. So the term paleo refers to our Paleolithic ancestors, which preceded the Neolithic, which was the domestication of grains and cereal crops, animals, living in city states and all that type of stuff. But it's an important and I think worthwhile point to make, because some people have almost like a rash-like response just hearing the term paleo diet, but they're not really too sure where the term comes from. It's not something that any one person cooked up. It was just an observation on the part of lots of archaeologists and anthropologists that our pre-westernized ancestors were pretty darn healthy, again, despite not having access to modern, Western medical interventions. And so there was a suggestion made by a physician, Boyd Eaton, back in 1986. He wrote a paper for the British Medical Journal, which made the case that if we were able to take all the good things that we have about modern medicine, but then look at health maintenance from the perspective of our Paleolithic ancestors, that we might have something really powerful there.
Well, it's interesting you say that, they were so healthy back then. When you speak with the medical professionals now and a lot of even patients, the concept is that, back then everybody was sick and they needed the medicine. And actually what the truth is, when you do look back there was not the hypertension, the diabetes, the heart attack. All of those things really are more of the modern era. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, it's observational. You can't 100% hang your hat on it, but I think that it's really, really interesting, and it's a great place to at least start having a conversation around this topic. If you can look at groups of folks who really don't show the types of very expensive Western degenerative diseases that we're really quite afflicted by, and that seem to be increasing at exponential rates. So, there's at some point, the just basic medical costs around this story are really going to force folks to reevaluate the way that we fundamentally tackle medicine. Like, I don't think we're going to be able to magic bullet ourselves out of type 2 diabetes, neurodegenerative disease. I wrote a piece for a separate book that I've been working on that kind of made the case that the discovery of antibiotics may have so influenced medicine that we really believe that there was a magic bullet for everything. Because pre-antibiotic era, if you got a scratch and that thing became infected, it was a pretty good chance you were either going to lose the limb or you might die.
Sure.
And so people really don't appreciate what a profound influence antibiotics were on modern medicine. And this was the time then when the term magic bullet was coined, and it was kind of that Walt Disney 1950s period where it was science better than nature, and they kind of forgot that science is actually a discovery of nature. And we really thought that we were going to figure out some way to circumvent the natural world. And then it was right around this time that we really characterized the DNA double helix. And so there was this thought that if we just understand our genetics, we'll have this all figured out. And then we had the Human Genome Project, and we made some discoveries, but it's been really lackluster in the way that it has influenced medicine. Like, medicine really hasn't changed, even though we understand the human genome at a deep level. And then we discovered epigenetics, which is the way that these genes get turned on and off. And that's another layer to the onion, but the way that you influence these things is kind of at the macro level: sleep, photoperiod, food, exercise, community, stress levels. And the systems are so complex, you can't try to manage them in a point-by-point fashion. Like, you've really just got to figure out something that's kind of a holistic, macroscopic view, and that's the way that you've got to tackle this stuff if you want to, stack the deck in your favor.
So I'm going to come back to that in just a second. I just want to ask you a very silly question, just to clear up. So when you're talking about a paleo diet and you're comparing it to like a Mediterranean diet, is my understanding here is that you're looking at a much more exterior viewpoint and actually looking at all the other factors that would influence this individual versus, just explain the difference to me a little bit.
The difference between like a paleo and a Mediterranean type diet?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they could end up being very, very similar, but generally you're going to see in the place in the Mediterranean diet where you would see grains, legumes, and dairy, you would see more fruits, vegetables, and nuts, basically, would be the paleo diet kind of analogy. But you would still see largely grass-fed meat, wild-caught seafood, seasonal fruits and vegetables, things like olive oil and all that are certainly good to go. And this is one of the unfortunate developments within the paleo diet concept is it was always, at least in my mind, it was always intended to be a template for a starting point. And what it turned into was kind of religious doctrine where people spent more time asking, is this paleo, than asking, is this a good option for me? And so it needed something almost like the Protestant Reformation or something like that, to come in and really simplify this story, because you had people really kind of losing their minds, because on the one hand you're not supposed to eat legumes, but yet green beans are okay, but green beans are a legume, and I mean it just becomes a really onerous set of rules to follow, instead of it just being kind of a simple template that we might start a little bit conservative. Maybe we start with no grains, no legumes, no dairy, particularly if somebody has GI problems or an autoimmune disease or something like that. But then once we get our health moving in a favorable direction, we really should experiment with, as broad a variety of foods as we can, and just kind of map what we do well with and what are the things that we, might do better to avoid.
Wow. So this is really a very, personalized approach. I mean, when you're let me just step back for 1 second. I'm sure a lot of people want to know the difference between Wired to Eat, the new book, and the original, the Paleo Solution that you wrote in 2010. What is the difference between those two? Like, how do those two compare?
Oh man, well, for one thing, the Wired to Eat, I had the benefit of 6, almost 7 years of additional experience working with people, and after the first book's been really successful. Like I'm very very fortunate, but part of the success is just that folks would buy the book and follow the program and get a lot of benefit and a lot of results, and then they would end up buying more books and giving it to friends and family and stuff like that. And so there was kind of a success breeds success from that perspective, but there were a couple of things that were problematic with the paleo concept. And the one I was just kind of talking about, that people started really turning the paleo concept into kind of religious doctrine, and they weren't really thinking things through, because you could make a case that coffee isn't paleo. But when we look at the research on coffee, it is really hard to find anything negative about coffee. Now, you can drink too much, it can disturb your sleep and all that type of stuff, but we have both epidemiological studies and also some good human trials where coffee consumption, tea consumption, like, it's a net win, but it's not, quote, paleo, So,
Okay.
There's a lot to be said about that. And then, there is out in the broader world, folks that have heard of this paleo diet concept, like they literally, they get kind of like an immune response, like it gives them a rash. They just don't even want to think about it, don't want to talk about it. And so I was thinking about that. And I was also thinking about another, what was the area that I saw folks tripped up by this experience of trying to change their life, trying to change their eating. And there seemed to be a really consistent pattern that emerged. And it was that people felt a lot of guilt around the notion that it was hard to make these changes. And in the back of my head, I was always thinking, well, it should be hard. I mean, we're wired for a completely different way of living. Like, to expect that you wouldn't find like a plate of nachos followed by a big bowl of ice cream really enticing, and that would be enticing every day of the week, like that's silly to expect that wouldn't be the case. And it's kind of silly to expect that, although pork loin and salad and asparagus is tasty, it's not as tasty as nachos and ice cream. I mean, there's just kind of a basic reality there. So I saw a lot of people that were failing because they would get into the process and then they would kind of run aground because it was hard and they felt like it shouldn't be hard. And I encountered a paper that was really amazing, and I'm blanking on the exact name of the paper, but it was talking about brain evolution and the omnivore's real dilemma. And it just made this point that we are opportunistic omnivores, that in our past, and really any organism that doesn't live in, with the ease that we have within our modern world. Our pets are kind of, I guess, the only other example, but everything on the planet that moves, that hunts or gathers or forages, it needs to get as much energy as possible, burning as little as possible. And this is called optimum foraging strategy. And this is just baked in the cake. It's simple economics. I mean, this is how you check to see if your business is functioning. Are you generating more than what you're spending? And any organism that consistently spends more than it gets, it's going to die. So we are fundamentally genetically wired to eat more and move less. But what are the recommendations that are made from the medical establishment, particularly dietitians? To solve your weight problems, all you need to do is eat less and move more. But that is diametrically opposed to our fundamental genetic wiring. And this is why that line of reasoning fails, and it sets people up for failure, because they feel like, man, if I was just better, if I was just a better person, if I didn't have this moral failing, then maybe I would be able to, affect these changes. But the fundamental story is that we are wired for a different way of living, and you've got to figure out nutritional strategies such that the foods that you eat are satisfying enough that you really don't, go hold up a mini mart and eat everything in the snack aisle, but but it's got to be livable over the long haul. And
so you're saying a lot of people, they'll take these losses, and these small losses add up, they just give up the diet at that point. They're heading to McDonald's.
Absolutely. Whereas, and I actually get into the topic of cheating in the book, and I think I've got a little bit of a different angle on that. As soon as someone asks me, like, when can I cheat, or, what do you think about cheat meals and stuff like that? Like, my hackles just go up immediately, because I'm like, okay, we're in the thick of it with this person.
Right.
And so I wasn't entirely sure why this got my goat every time I heard it. But one thing was consistent, was that the person who asked that question was going to be a pain in the backside. Like, there was just guaranteed.
Oh yeah, it's guaranteed. You know that. That's
going to be some drama with them.
Sure.
But one day I actually sat down. I'm like, what's the etymology of the word cheat? Like, what's the root word, and what does it really mean? And the word cheat, if you look it up and get like a Webster's dictionary kind of definition, it's basically to obtain an unfair advantage. And I was like, that's interesting. So if you're supposed to be eating a particular way, whether it's paleo or vegan or macrobiotic, or, pick your flavor. But then if you say, well, I cheated on this diet, and by cheated, it usually means that we eat some sort of junk food. Where's the unfair advantage there? There's no unfair advantage. Like, you didn't, you can cheat on a relationship, you can cheat on your taxes, you could cheat in, golf, but there's no cheating on food. There's consequences to food. And that's it. Alpha, omega, done. And if somebody is going on and on about, cheat meals and can you cheat on food, then we've got a fundamental problem that's really existing on a psychological level. And people need to understand, you eat food, you have consequences to the food that you eat. That's it. And so it again is just a baseline. If people are focusing on whether or not they're cheating on their diet, then we're in a psychological place that we are highly unlikely to succeed. But if we get to a spot where we're like, okay, I can eat whatever I want, but I'm choosing to eat from category A for the most part and really avoid categories B, C, and D, because I understand what the downside is. And so we make an informed choice. And the challenge in all this stuff is that our brains are wired up in a way that our logical forebrain, where we do all this rational processing, is quite separate from the hedonic centers of our ancient brain, where sex and food and survival are all processed. And so the challenge, though, is that, taking that understanding, but being able to push it into that emotive part of the brain and really make that part stick. And that's where some things like 30-day resets and stuff that can help you get a handle on your neuroregulation of appetite, that can help you to appreciate simpler meals. That's the way that you can rewire your appetite and have a higher likelihood of success. But, again, that notion of cheating is really one of those wacky, like, red flags that if I see somebody talking about that, I know that we've got a live one. It's going to be some work. Yeah.
Well, you also find, I've got to imagine that, people, when I was younger, right, I could eat anything. I worked out all the time. It was not a problem. As I've gotten older, my gut's gotten bigger. I'm more interested now. Do you find that people wait until they have some illness, or there's certain things that drive them to you, that you're getting people that maybe aren't quite as healthy? Or what is the normal person reading your book coming to you for advice? Are they healthy and young, or are they a little bit older, or they're going through some difficulties?
I had two brackets of people that have followed my work, and the one group is composed of folks that were largely forgotten or ignored by medicine. And these are the people that just had years of health problems that nobody could really figure out. Maybe it was related to gut. Maybe it was related to autoimmunity. There seemed to be systemic inflammation, but nothing fit into those perfect, like, ICD-10 diagnostic criteria. And so the person just kind of, got kicked along. And when they did something that looked like a paleo diet or an autoimmune paleo type approach, it was shocking, the results that these people got. And, again, like they would, because of social media, the timing of all this stuff is interesting. People were able to blog, and people were able to share experiences on social media. And the cool thing about nutritional interventions, like you can talk to people about religion or political affiliations, but with religion, you've got to die before you figure out whether or not the person was right or wrong. With political affiliations, you kind of have to watch the time course of a empire and see, does socialism work or does, capitalism work or whatever.
Sure.
But with a diet, it's 30 days. Like if you can just muscle through 30 days, it's kind of like trying on a sweater. Like, are you do you like how it fits? Is it worth the...
It's easy to talk about. Listen, Rob, I'm going to back you up totally. In my office, each treatment room has a television, but they're all on the same circuit, right? So if we put on CNN or Fox, there's always somebody complaining. But if we put on the Food Channel, nobody complains. They just sit there and stare at it. They love it. So it's food seems to be that thing that you could discuss with anybody, and it just knows no boundaries. So I totally back you up on that.
There's some at least potential for getting the person to try it. You may appeal to their logical sense and like, hey man, you can do anything for 30 days, give it a shot. And so they give it a shot. You might even guilt people a little bit. It's like, hey, your wife did it for 30 days. Like you can let her out. And after that 30-day period, folks generally look, feel, and perform better. If they did blood work before and afterwards, the blood lipids look better, their inflammatory markers look better. And then the person can do something really crazy. And that's just sit back and look at what they did and ask themselves a question: is the reward worth the cost? Clearly not eating the junk food that we all would like to eat, there's some cost associated with that. And sure. I'm not here to proselytize to people to say that they should or shouldn't do one thing over the other. But I really, kind of my life's mission is just to let people know that they've got choices. I
like your approach. It's really empowering the people. Rob, let me ask you, in reading Wired, you talk at length about personalized nutrition. Is this what you're talking, like what is that and why is that important? Is this what you're going into a little bit as well?
Yeah, the personalized nutrition is interesting because on the one hand, we have to have simple stories to try to help people. Like if I roll in and somebody... they've lived a real life, like they have a social life and they don't think about nutritional biochemistry like I do. They're not a geek, and God bless them for not being a geek. But if they've got some health problems or they want to lose some weight, I've got to get them going somehow. And so on the one hand, having a really simple story to tell, whether that's paleo or vegan or high carb, low fat or high fat, low carb. These things are pretty easy stories that give people lane lines. It's kind of like when you take kids bowling and they have the kid bumper lanes that pop up so the ball can't go in the gutter. Like that's kind of what you're doing, and that works for a certain cross section of folks. But inevitably, the recommendation that you make to 100 people, there's going to be some percentage of people that recommendation fits and some percentage that it really doesn't and that it needs some tweaking. And in general, we can make this broad statement. Folks will benefit from eating largely whole, unprocessed food. Like that's a pretty safe spot to start. But then there's a lot of detail and nuance in that. Like genetically, when I had my 23andMe testing done, based off my genetics, I'm like 300% more likely than the average person to develop type 2 diabetes. And interestingly, both of my parents developed type 2 diabetes in their 30s and 40s. And I've noticed over the course of time that if I eat too many carbs, whether it's sweet potatoes or fruit or rice or what have you, I gain body fat and my blood lipids go sideways and I feel pretty terrible. And, I have poor blood sugar control. And again, like I'm out of that Northern European stock that was hunter-gatherers not very long ago. Like agriculture arrived in these areas pretty late in the game. The only people that you would find maybe even more recent would be Native Americans. And we see, very, very high rates of type 2 diabetes in Native Americans. And so, there's some customization that needs to happen there. And so what I try to do with Wired to Eat is start folks on a general path, and we use a 30-day reset to do that, where it's basically an anti-inflammatory diet. We get people rewiring their neuroregulation of appetite. They start, healing inflammation. They heal their gut. Their sleep improves. And then at the end of that process, we do what's called a 7-day carb test, where we monitor our blood sugars and we start testing different carbohydrate sources. And then based off that, we're able to get a really concrete sense, both on an objective level and a subjective level, like how do you feel after that 50-gram bowl of rice? What does your blood sugar look like after that 50-gram bowl of rice? And it's fascinating. So my wife is quite a bit smaller than I am, less body weight and everything. So you could make an argument that she should be less capable of dealing with carbohydrate than I am. But I recently did an experiment where I was wearing a continuous blood glucose monitor. It basically samples your blood glucose once a minute for the duration of the test. And we ate the same amount of carbohydrate from rice. And it was 50 grams of carbs, and it was basically like a cup and a quarter of white rice. And my blood sugar hit 178, which is sky high.
Wow.
And I felt like absolute hell from that. And I felt like hell for about 2 days after that. Now, my wife, her blood sugar, I think, got to like 128, 134, something like that. So, 40, 50 points lower than what mine was, but she's smaller than I am. She has less muscle mass than I do, but her insulin sensitivity and her ability to store glucose is dramatically better than mine. And we've just kind of observed that. Like, she eats kind of lowish carb paleo, but she eats way more sweet potatoes than I do, more yams, more yucca, more fruit, and she does fine on that. But if I ate the way that she did, I would have some problems. And I've seen that both on the subjective level, where it's kind of like, well, how do I feel after a meal? It's like, I feel bad. And the objective level, where I've tested blood glucose. And so that's this opportunity and this promise of personalized nutrition, where we can go beyond the one-size-fits-all diets. Like, we've got to have an orienting spot to start people, but then we can't let them dig in like a tick and turn that starting place into a religious doctrine that, like, this is the only thing that works,
Do you think people subjectively are going to be drawn to foods that they need? In other words, are there if I'm being drawn towards yams more, is that because I need whatever in there and I can tolerate it better? Is there a natural kind of an inclination towards that, or is it not really? Like when you compare subjective to objective?
My sense of that is the only kind of micronutrient that we can taste is salt, sodium. And we actively seek out sodium. Most organisms out in the environment seek out sodium. There's some really amazing video of some goats in Italy that climb the edge of a dam.
Seen that. Yes,
and they lick the salt crystals out of there. Yes. I mean, it's totally crazy. So my understanding of this is that in general, what we are doing is we are definitely seeking out certain palate and flavor profiles, and it's salty, sweet, umami, bitter. But baked in the cake, if we are eating whole unprocessed foods, historically, your brain just needed to have, if we think about this less like calories in, calories out, and more about information processing, when you eat different foods, protein, carbs, fat, and they have different phytonutrients that turn genes on and off in different ways, we're getting a very different metabolic response from a yam with some grass-fed butter on it than we do from a plate of, say, like just plain white rice or just kind of denuded white bread or something like that. So, baked in the cake historically, if you got a really nice mix of flavor profiles from whole unprocessed foods, just baked in that cake, you ended up getting all the vital nutrients that you needed. But what happens today, because we are most of these foods are stripped of these vital nutrients in the processing kind of situation, then you end up seeking out those flavors. But and this is where it's pretty well understood that, like, if people are protein deficient, they will tend to eat more and more and more food, trying to meet a protein satiety level. And this is
hoping it will be there. Yeah, hoping it would be there. Sure.
Yeah.
No, I understand. Well, let me ask, ketosis and fasting, these are pretty hot topics. In your book, Wired to Eat, you have a chapter devoted to this. Can you talk to folks about the benefit and potential pitfalls of fasting ketosis?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of these modalities. I've done a lot of work with the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Committee. I've gone and spoken to the SEAL teams and the special boat teams for a number of years, and it's a huge honor to do that. And one of the big topics that I talk about is traumatic brain injury. And there's a whole host of neurodegenerative diseases, and also physical trauma, traumatic brain injury, that seem to respond remarkably well to ketogenic diets and fasting. And what happens in fasting and or a ketogenic diet, once we drop carbohydrate intake below a certain threshold, we can't really produce or release enough glucose to run the brain. We've got lots of body fat, even if we're reasonably lean folks, but body fat doesn't move around the body actually that well, and it particularly is poor at crossing the blood-brain barrier. And so we start metabolizing lots of fat, but when we have a lack of carbohydrate or protein that can get turned into carbohydrate, we start producing these things called ketone bodies. And these ketone bodies are interesting in that they're water soluble, so they can head throughout the whole body, particularly passing through the blood-brain barrier. And they carry the energetic kind of weight that you would see from fats, but they are portable the way that a glucose molecule is. And so it provides an alternate fuel source for the brain. And someone who has fasted for 2 days, 3 days, they're going to have some decently low blood glucose levels and reasonably high blood ketone levels. And this is a completely normal state of affairs. There's nothing dangerous with this. But where the medical scene has kind of gone sideways on this story is there's this condition called ketoacidosis, which typically occurs in type 1 diabetics that are poorly managing their blood glucose levels, and they become effectively insulin resistant to the point that they can't really get glucose into their cells. So they start producing huge amounts of ketones, and then the ketones rise to really, really very high levels, much higher than what you would see in a starvation ketosis state, and that can cause seizures and death. So there's a legitimate situation where you want to be concerned about ketoacidosis. But what happened is the physicians and healthcare providers forgot their biochemistry and forgot that fasting ketosis or nutritional ketosis, which can be brought about by eating a moderate protein, low carb, high fat diet, these are completely different states than ketoacidosis. And the analogy there is that a diabetic is someone who has uncontrolled or poorly controlled levels of blood glucose, and that can become injurious. Someone in a ketoacidotic state is an individual with unhealthful levels of ketone bodies. Both of those are pathological states. Both of those can be mitigated by a more appropriate dietary approach.
Sure. And the benefit of like being in a ketosis would be, I mean, I've just heard things that cancer does not grow in those kind of environments. Is that true? I mean, are there things like that?
There's some cancers which seem to be what's called endothelial derived from embryological development, and these are breast, colon, prostate, glioblastoma, astrocyte brain tumors. They appear to respond pretty favorably to a low carb, low glucose environment. There are certain types of cancers that only run off glucose, and if you can starve them of glucose, there's some suggestion that may, as a singular treatment modality, may offer some benefit. Or if you were to use conventional therapies like chemo and radiation plus a ketogenic diet, those ketone bodies are actually making the cancer unstable because it doesn't have enough energy, substrate to keep it going. And then you hit it with the chemo and radiation, and so it could make the conventional therapies more effective.
Wow.
Now, there are other types of cancers like malignant melanoma, which doesn't appear to benefit specifically from the ketogenic diet intervention. Like ketosis doesn't seem to benefit that type of cancer specifically, but interestingly, the ketogenic state actually makes our normal cells more resilient against things like chemo and radiation. So there's a potential that even though it may not, in certain situations, chemo, radiation plus keto diet may directly influence the ability to clear particular types of cancer. In other situations, it may just be that allows the individual to tolerate the chemo and radiation better, therefore hopefully making those treatment modalities more efficacious. And we're just in the very beginnings of studying this type of stuff. But the title of that chapter is Hammers, Drills, and Ketosis, the one tool your doctor will never use. And I use the analogy that, so my dad was a contractor. And although there would be all kinds of debates and pissing matches about, you should do this or you should do that, but I noticed that there were some broad categories. Like nobody argued about whether or not you should use a bandsaw when the screwdriver was the appropriate tool. There just wasn't any drama around that. But it's interesting within nutritional sciences and medicine, there's huge drama around whether you should eat a higher carb diet or a low carb diet. And these things are just tools. There's a plausible reasons for either approach, but there's just this drama and this lack of really understanding and really just recognizing that these things are tools. And so I go in pretty deep on ketosis and fasting, explain what they are, what the potential benefits are. For some people who are trying to lose significant amount of body weight, they may have some damage or dysregulation to their hypothalamus that the only thing that's going to work is a ketogenic diet because it appears to offer some neuroprotective effects. And so some people have played with everything they can imagine dietarily, and they don't succeed until they use a ketogenic approach. Now, there are other people who might be CrossFitters again or hard-charging athletes, and they want to lean out a little bit. And they think that a ketogenic diet would be great because they just saw a story where somebody lost 200 pounds on a ketogenic diet. So losing the last 5 pounds that they want to lose, should be easy. But for these folks, they're already lean, they're already insulin sensitive, and they're training at such a high work capacity that a ketogenic diet might not be appropriate for them. They might be more appropriate for something else. So and with regards to fasting, a lot of people are playing around with things like time-restricted feeding or intermittent fasting. I think there's huge potential benefit there. But the people that I've seen who are willing to do intermittent fasting are the same folks that do CrossFit 6 days a week. They eat 6 grams of carbs a month, and they're just crazy.
They're totally committed. Totally committed. Yeah,
they should be committed. Yeah. And the type B computer programmer who is laid back and mellow, but really sedentary, that person would probably do great with a time-restricted feeding, which is what I recommend in the book. Maybe you do dinner around 5 or 6 p.m., and then you don't make breakfast happen until 10 a.m. or noon. And so you're really constricting the period of time that you eat, which typically means you're going to reduce the total caloric load, but there's also some benefits above and beyond that. But I think, a pretty good job of describing what these things are, but then also why you would want to do them and why you might not want to do them. But they are clearly really great tools, the same way that, nobody would argue that a screwdriver or a pair of pliers aren't great tools, but you certainly don't want to use the wrong one for the wrong job.
No, absolutely. Right. The whole point of our broadcast is really in search of the holy grail of health. If I were to pose the question to you, what is the holy grail of health? What would your answer be, sir?
Oh, man, that grail in my mind would be made of what I call the 4 pillars of health, which would be sleep, food, movement, and community. And within the sleep part, I expand that and talk about photoperiod, because it's not just how much sleep we get, but actually what time we go to bed, what time we wake up, how much light we get on our person and in our eyes during the day, the types and amounts of light that we get in our eyes and on our person at night. Like when the sun goes down, we should be in a dark environment. Yeah, and the circadian rhythm piece of all this is really fascinating, and it's pretty clear that the person that gets sleep, say from 10 a.m. to 6 a.m. is very, very different than the results of the person who gets sleep from midnight to 8 a.m. Even though it's the same amount of rack time, both of those people have a very different experience of their photoperiod, and that will influence their circadian rhythm and the depth of their sleep, and that influences insulin sensitivity. And so even though I spend an inordinate amount of time talking about food in the book, I could really make an argument that the sleep and photoperiod piece is the most important part. It's just profoundly important. But then, clearly getting our nutrition dialed in better is super important. Movement or exercise. Most people hate exercise. Everybody loves moving. So, I call it movement. And the most important feature there is you find something that you like, that you're going to keep doing again and again and again. I like When people do some resistance training, I like people doing a little bit of sprint interval stuff. I think it's really good for our metabolism. I think it's a good anti-aging approach. But if you just hate the gym and you would rather hike and like throw rocks in your backyard, then hike and throw rocks in your backyard. That's way more important that you just stay.
Well, at least you're doing something. At least you're consistently doing something. Yeah. No, I love it. I love it. Bro, I tell you what, I could talk to you for like 12 hours. I mean, you are amazing. This is a great interview. I'm going to ask you one final question, and I'm going to ask you just how people could get in touch with you. But you have an interesting take on the word hypochondria. Can you just talk to that a little bit?
Yeah. So, again, like I like poking around in the history of words, and I was really, so some people become kind of marginally famous in this fitness realm, for different things. Some people have buns of steel, some people have rock hard abs. My claim to fame is I know a lot about poo, so I think a lot about the gut.
Poo? Okay.
Yeah, the gut, digestion, poo.
Okay, I want to just end the interview right now, but thank you.
Probably should. But so that gets me thinking about the gut a lot. And so I think about the gut and its relationship to our overall health and whatnot. And so I forget when this popped into my head, but I was thinking about the word hypochondria because I was thinking about so many of the things that go along with the hypochondria individual. And who is this person? They're the person that thinks they're always sick and they've always got a health problem. And I started really noodling on that. And when you look at the Latin derivative, hypo means below, chondria means cartilage or ribs. But really, if you literally look below the ribs, it's the gut.
Right.
And so, Hippocrates made the point that all disease starts in the gut, and he's generally accepted as being kind of the father of, Western medical thought and whatnot.
Sure.
And so I started poking around, and I still haven't come to a full conclusion on this, but I was trying to figure out, did the hypochondriac individual, were they called that because, all of these weird symptoms that nobody could pin down? This is my mom. This was the description I gave of my mom here at the beginning. Is it all going on in their gut? And is it the reason why it's so hard to pin this stuff down and get a definitive answer is that's a complex process, and they don't, oftentimes fall into perfect categories. So I look at that hypochondria story in a very different way. The hypochondriac, I think, oftentimes they have some really complex health issues going on that are likely gut derivative, or at least have some gut issues, but they're not severe enough that it's going to push them into a definitive diagnosis of like autoimmunity or irritable bowel syndrome or something like that.
So they're feeling something's not right, and they're expressing that how best they can, and people are starting to say like, "You're crazy, knock it off for it." Is that almost the dynamics of it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's my hopeful. I hope that has some impact on the greater story of medicine. And I'm still trying to figure out like why the hypochondriac was called, the Latin derivative below the ribs. Like why did that get ascribed to that? Because to me, it was some insight recognizing that there was something going on in the gut with these people.
Well, it's fascinating just doing these the podcasts. I've spoken to so many people, and just for me, it's changed my life just because learning, I never even attributed anything to the gut. And so far, you included, I've spoken to 4 experts that are bringing it right back to the same thing. So Hippocrates sounds like he was right on the money way back when. Rob, how would people find out about you? How would they find out about your book, Wired to Eat? How would they do that, sir?
Most everything is available on robbwolf.com. Wired to Eat is available for pre-order everywhere books are sold. It will be available in stores and will ship from Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and all those places March 21st.
Robb Wolf, thank you, sir, for joining us. It was a great podcast. Greatly appreciated.
Doc, huge honor being on.
Thank you.
This episode is sponsored by New Jersey Foot and Ankle Center in Oredo, New Jersey. Remember, when you have a foot problem, you've got a foot doctor in the family. Weekend and evening appointments are available. Call us at 201-261-9445. Once again, that's 201-261-9445. Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes over at drdanspeaks.com. If you're loving the show, head over to iTunes and leave us a review, and we'll catch you next time. This episode is brought to you by Slate Media Productions. Provided by, for more information, Randy Ramos Jr. Visit Slate Media to see and hear more of his work, visit randyramosjr.com.